Jorah Mormont had never truly known peace, nor had he ever possessed the luxury of complete loyalty. The rumors that shadowed him, of debts and desperation, of a tarnished name left behind on Bear Island, told a story of a man whose honor had cracked beneath the burden of his own misdeeds. He arrived in Pentos not seeking redemption, but opportunity. Word among the wharves and wine-sinks was that the last Targaryen heirs had found refuge under the roof of Magister Illyrio Mopatis, who was known to court influence wherever it might arise. Jorah saw them as a means to his own salvation, or at least as a path leading away from the shadows that clung to him. Yet behind that aim lurked another face of the truth. He had pledged his service to one who did not wear the banner of the Targaryen dragon. He had promised reports to King Robert's spymaster, Varys, who wanted every breath of these supposed heirs monitored. And so Jorah stepped onto the tiled floors of Illyrio's manse with a quiet confidence that belied a flicker of shame. From the very start, he was more messenger than guardian, more betrayer than friend. He observed Daenerys Targaryen with the eyes of a man taking stock, nothing more than a potential asset or threat. She was still a girl then, standing meekly beside her silver-haired brother Viserys, who exuded arrogance like a stench. Jorah could see Viserys' fragility. The beggar king wore his pride like a thin cloak that would tear at the slightest tug. Daenerys, however, was a different study altogether. Her silence was not fear, or not only fear. It held a quiet watchfulness. She was younger than her brother by a few years, but the discrepancy in their composure was vast. Jorah knew that if any Targaryen had a chance to seize the destiny their father had lost, it would not be Viserys. But he did not dwell on that notion too deeply. He was here to watch, to record, and to deliver knowledge to those who would pay for it with gold and pardon. Should she or Viserys claim the Iron Throne, Jorah believed he could always slither to whatever side beckoned him next. He was, after all, a man who had learned how to survive above all else. The manse's marble columns gleamed in the afternoon sun, and tapestries of colorful silks hung along the corridors as Illyrio led them to a private courtyard. There, tables laden with exotic fruits and spiced meats beckoned. Jorah hovered along the edges, carefully measuring each step, each word uttered. He noted the color of Daenerys's eyes, which were a lilac shade rare and unsettling, as though some sorcery slept behind her irises. Viserys, in contrast, had eyes so clouded by resentment that Jorah doubted he ever saw the world as it was. Illyrio, smiling and unctuous as ever, spoke of alliances and the great Dothraki Khal, who would soon arrive to take Daenerys's hand in marriage. Jorah pretended ignorance of these plans, though through his channels, he already knew King Robert's men kept a close watch for this rumored arrangement. He wondered how the Targaryen children felt about such a union. Viserys, from what he could see, was flushed with triumph. Daenerys looked more like a cornered fawn, but Jorah dared not pity her. No, he reminded himself every detail was a tool. He would slip away later that night and send word to the spider's little birds. This alliance, if consummated, would threaten Robert's hold on the throne, or so the usurper believed. Jorah's mission was to ensure these details reached the Red Keep in time for the king to decide if a swift assassination was in order. Jorah tried to smother any questions of conscience that flickered in him. It was too soon to weigh the morality of what he was doing. He was a man in exile, disgraced and desperate. Such men rarely had the privilege to choose the nobler path. He saw Daenerys try to speak, stammering about her uncertainties. She asked Illyrio about Khal Drogo in a soft voice, as though the name might burn her tongue. Illyrio replied with elaborate praise and extravagant gestures, describing the Khal's wealth, his endless khalasar of fierce warriors, and his monstrous braid that grazed the back of his thighs, a symbol of many victories. Jorah watched the swirl of emotion in Daenerys' expression. Trepidation, curiosity, even the barest flicker of wonder. If she were to wed a Dothraki warlord, she would soon find herself on the grassy sea of Essos, away from this softly lit courtyard. Jorah wondered if she knew precisely how harsh that life could be. Probably not, he decided, and perhaps it would harden her. Perhaps it would break her. Either way, it was none of his concern, so long as he got what he needed. Night fell and the manse's corridors gleamed with lamplight. Jorah slipped from his guest chamber, ensuring his footsteps made barely a whisper on the mosaic tiles. He had to find a way to pass his message discreetly. An urchin boy sat in a side passage, gnawing on a morsel of bread. Jorah leaned forward and whispered a few phrases in the boy's ear, placing a silver coin in his hand. The boy scampered off, the reflection of the coin dancing in the lamplight. The plan was simple. The child would deliver Jorah's message to the correct alleyway at the appointed hour. Varys' spies would find it, decode it, and relay it back across the narrow sea. It might take a fortnight or a month, but the ravens would carry it eventually, and Robert or his council would know. Viserys Targaryen was to marry his sister off to Khal Drogo in exchange for an army. The next day, the Khal arrived. He came at the head of a column of riders, their leather vests and painted horses shining under the sun. Daenerys was dressed in a pale linen gown that complemented her hair, and Jorah witnessed how she stood as still as a porcelain statue, trembling only in the eyes. Viserys, for his part, looked upon the Khal with a nervous greed. Jorah had to grant that Drogo was indeed an imposing figure. He stood head and shoulders above most men, with a powerful build that spoke of both skill and brutality. The marriage was agreed upon with little pomp at first, for the Dothraki seldom indulged in elaborate ceremony. Instead, the Khal's eyes assessed Daenerys like a warrior judges a prize mare. For a moment, Jorah felt a pang of unease. Despite all his cynicism, he found a flicker of sympathy for this young woman thrust into such a savage world. But almost immediately, he reminded himself that whatever happened to Daenerys, it was a path she had to take, her fate, not his. Besides, compassion could be fatal to a spy. On the night of the wedding, Jorah lingered in the crowds of the Dothraki, half a spectator, half a guardian. The Khalasar reveled in unhinged celebration. Fires leapt high, wine spilled across the dirt, and the pounding of drums thundered through the air. There were fights, of course, and at least 2 men died before the night was through. Jorah watched Daenerys seated on a raised platform, gazing into a chaos she had never imagined. Though her face was composed, he could sense her fear. Khal Drogo approached her only when the drunken revelry was at its peak, offering a silver horse as a wedding gift. Daenerys' eyes widened. Jorah saw an instant of wonder, a small light that cut through her dread. The men around them roared in approval. If the bride had expected a gentle courtship, she would find none. But this gift was a statement. The Khal would provide in his way. Jorah stepped closer, turning the small corner of his mouth into a feigned smile. He had brought a trifling wedding gift himself, a selection of rare books about the 7 kingdoms, or so he claimed. In truth, the texts were copies hastily procured from Illyrio's library. Still, they served their purpose. Daenerys thanked him softly, bowing her head. Viserys barely glanced at Jorah. The beggar king's attention was locked on the swirling forms of the dancing Dothraki, gold and weaponry. He saw in them the means to seize the Iron Throne he believed was his by right. Jorah listened to Viserys boasting, though few paid heed, about how soon he would cross the narrow sea with a Dothraki horde at his back. For a man who claimed to be the rightful king, his voice shook far too easily. Jorah filed it all away. Knowledge was his currency. As the wedding concluded and Daenerys was led away by her new husband to consummate their union, Jorah quietly retreated. He had done what was expected of him. He had shown the appropriate courtesy. Now, with the feast still raging, he took a horse from Illyrio's stables and rode to a different part of Pentos. There, in a small rundown tavern, he found another messenger. This one was older and slower of wit than the urchin boy, but he knew the right contacts to ensure that King Robert's informers remained well-fed with details. Jorah repeated what he had seen. The wedding was complete. Daenerys Targaryen was now a Khaleesi of the Dothraki, and if Viserys had his way, she would bear Drogo's heir, a half-Dothraki, half-Targaryen child who could one day challenge the usurper's throne. When he was finished, Jorah's voice grew tight in his throat for a moment. He wondered what would happen if Daenerys truly stepped into power. But he dismissed the notion. Let the 7 decide. His role was simply to report. The days that followed found Daenerys riding at the head of the Khalasar, learning the ways of the Dothraki. She often looked exhausted, her cheeks sunburned, and her posture stiff. Jorah knew from experience how unkind saddle sores could be to the uninitiated. Yet each time she was offered a moment of rest, she refused to show weakness. Drogo observed her from a distance, occasionally with a flicker of approval in his dark eyes. Viserys, on the other hand, fumed each day, feeling neglected, suspecting that the Khalasar treated him as nothing more than a nuisance. He demanded from Daenerys what he believed she owed him as her brother and rightful king. Jorah watched the siblings' simmering tensions with the attentiveness of a man writing a letter in his mind. He saw how Daenerys began to transform, bit by bit, under the scorching Essosi sun. She grew quieter in some respects, sharper in others. She began to notice how the Dothraki wove their braids, how they rode without stirrups, how their language, harsh as it might sound, had layers of meaning that revealed who they valued and who they despised. Jorah approached her one evening as the Khalasar made camp near a small stream. She sat by the water, removing her boots, wincing at the blisters on her feet. Jorah knelt and offered a piece of cloth to dry her skin. She accepted, murmuring a polite word of thanks. Her voice was tinged with the fatigue of endless riding. Jorah noticed that any trace of the timid girl from Pentos was fading behind the walls of determination she was building. "You are adapting well," he said gently. "The Dothraki respect a Khaleesi who does not complain." Daenerys gave him a wary look. "Do they respect me? Sometimes I am not so sure." He shrugged. "They respect Drogo, and if you are strong, they will respect you too." He hesitated, choosing his words. If I can ever be of service, Your Grace, I would be honored." She gave a small nod. There was wariness in her eyes, and he could sense she trusted no one fully, not even him. But she needed an ally who spoke the common tongue, so she tolerated his presence and counsel. The irony stung him for a moment. She needed him, unaware he was the most dangerous snake in her midst. It was a role he had chosen, after all. Jorah continued to send messages at intervals, each laden with small updates. How the Khal received Daenerys, how Viserys was treated, how swiftly the Khalasar moved. There was little immediate reply, but Jorah assumed his messages reached Varys eventually. Occasionally, he wondered if King Robert had grown impatient, if an assassin might soon arrive to cut Daenerys' throat while she slept. The Dothraki Sea was vast, and foreigners rarely ventured deep into it. Any killer who tried would face thousands of mounted warriors. Jorah guessed that for now, Robert might wait and see. Or perhaps the king had already sent instructions for Jorah himself to act. If those instructions came, would he have the stomach for it? He banished the question from his mind each time it arose. His betrayal was a matter of survival. After he had sold poachers into slavery on Bear Island, an act that had forever disgraced him in the eyes of the Seven Kingdoms, he had fled across the narrow sea, seeking to escape Robert's justice. The king had sentenced Jorah to death in absentia. Now he served as an informant, hoping that by proving useful, he might earn a royal pardon. That was his singular goal. Words like honor or loyalty had long since become hollow to him, or so he told himself. Weeks passed, and the Dothraki journeyed beyond the coastal lands, moving into the deep grasslands of Essos. Daenerys began to adjust to the rhythms of their life. Rising at dawn, riding until midday, feasting on horseflesh and goat, drinking fermented mare's milk that made her grimace. She did not yield. She began to speak more confidently, learning Dothraki phrases. Jorah watched her with a subtle fascination, though he reminded himself that it was mere observation for his reports. Still, he could not deny she possessed a kind of quiet fortitude that outshone Viserys. The beggar king was treated with scorn by the Khalasar, especially after an incident where he tried to strike Daenerys in front of the warriors. Their reaction had been immediate, some drew blades. Only Daenerys' firm command saved her brother from having his head removed right then and there. Yet from that day it was clear, Viserys might fancy himself a dragon, but among the Dothraki, he was little more than a mewling child. Around a campfire one evening, Jorah heard whispers that Khal Drogo planned to travel to Viz Dothrak, the sacred city where the Dashkaleen resided. There, Daenerys would be formally recognized as a Khaleesi before the ancient crones. Jorah listened, quietly storing every detail. He wrote out a coded message the following dawn, giving it to a traveling merchant who had been paid well to pass it along to Pentos. The merchant did not know the message's contents, only that he would be further rewarded upon safe delivery. Jorah lingered in the merchant's tent, watching him seal the parchment in a small wooden box. Anxiety twitched in Jorah's belly. If Robert or Varys decided that Daenerys' pregnancy, if it happened, was too great a threat, they might dispatch an assassin. Could Jorah stand idly by while she was murdered under the blazing Essosi sun? He swallowed, forcing the thought away. He had chosen this path. There was no turning back. His own life and redemption hung in the balance. At Vis Dothrak, the Khalasar thundered past tall statues of the Great Stallion, and Daenerys was led to the vast marketplace where riders from across the Dothraki world traded goods. She was greeted by the Dashkaleen, who pressed upon her wisdom in cryptic words. Jorah watched from a respectful distance. He found the city's size overwhelming. Dozens of hollowed-out monuments, acres of tents, and thousands of Dothraki warriors and their families. But a hush of sacredness lay over the place. No blood was allowed to be shed there, as decreed by the Dothraki gods. It was a place where even Khal Drogo's wrath had to be tempered. In this sanctuary, Jorah felt a strange sense of calm, or perhaps it was merely exhaustion from riding for so long. One evening, Daenerys invited him to her tent. She had begun confiding in him ever since he had explained more about Westeros. Its houses, its banners, its shifting alliances. She did not yet know that he was feeding that knowledge straight back to the usurper's court. Under the light of an oil lamp, she asked him what he knew of her father, the Mad King. Jorah struggled to offer a diplomatic answer, recalling the atrocities Aerys II had committed, how the realm had turned against him. But he also spoke of how the Targaryens had united the Seven Kingdoms centuries ago, forging a dynasty that held the Iron Throne for nearly 300 years. Daenerys listened, quiet and intent. "I want to know the truth," she said, her lilac eyes catching the lamplight. "Not the whispers Viserys tells me to believe, or the songs of minstrels who might want my favor. I need to understand why my father lost everything. If I am to reclaim it, if I am to—" She halted, uncertain how much she dared reveal to this exiled knight who was still half a stranger to her. "I only want what is rightfully mine," she said at last in a soft voice. Jorah feigned sympathy. He spoke of honor, of how the realm was torn apart by Robert's rebellion, of how many believed Rhaegar Targaryen was the last best hope for a just rule. He saw how Daenerys' face glowed when he described her elder brother, Rhaegar, a man she had never known. Daenerys had been born on Dragonstone amidst the storm that gave her the epithet Daenerys Stormborn. She had no memory of King's Landing, of the Red Keep's halls, or of the Mad King's final hours. She only had stories, and Jorah realized that in her mind, she was assembling these fragments into a mosaic of her family's legacy. His words might shape her ambitions or quell them. He chose each phrase carefully, never forgetting that he had a duty to keep her in check for the spider. He told her Rhaegar was said to be kind and brave, beloved by many, but that fate had not been merciful. She blinked in thought and nodded. Then she dismissed him with a polite smile. Jorah left her tent, strangely burdened by the knowledge that his words had given her hope, while his messages to the Seven Kingdoms might one day ensure that hope was snuffed out. In Vis Dothrak's labyrinth of tents and stalls, time slowed. The sound of horses and the murmur of countless voices became a daily lullaby. Jorah began to sense a shift in Daenerys' presence. Where once she had trembled before her towering husband, now she moved with a gentle but unmistakable authority. The Khalasar's women, who once barely recognized her, now followed her lead in small ways. She was still not truly one of them, but she was no longer a frightened outsider. Even Khal Drogo seemed to take some pride in this. Jorah noted how Drogo would occasionally let his gaze linger on his wife with a hint of satisfaction, as though she were becoming a worthy consort to the greatest Khal in the world. Viserys' descent, meanwhile, accelerated. He could not bear to watch his sister gain the respect he believed belonged to him. He confronted her often, calling her a whore to the Dothraki, insulting her in the common tongue. Daenerys learned to endure these rages, but the Dothraki around them were growing less and less tolerant. When finally Viserys drew a sword in the sacred city, fueled by wine and anger, he made the fatal mistake of threatening to cut Daenerys' unborn child from her womb. There was no return from such a transgression. In V's Dothrak, to draw blood was sacrilege, but Khal Drogo found a way to punish him without shedding blood on the sacred grounds. The memory of that punishment would remain etched in Jorah's mind. Drogo had him restrained, forced a pot of molten gold above the fire, and then poured it over Viserys' head. No blood touched the ground, and the last Targaryen male, the self-styled Beggar King, perished screaming as the gold burned into his flesh. Jorah stood witness to the horror, along with everyone else in the Khalasar. Daenerys watched without flinching, and at the moment of her brother's death, she whispered, "He was no dragon. Fire cannot kill a dragon." A hush fell. Jorah realized that her words signaled a profound transformation. She was no longer the frightened girl reliant on Viserys' guidance. She was Khaleesi, blood of the dragon, and she had just let her brother die. Or rather, she had accepted that he must die. In that moment, something inside Jorah shifted as well. His mission to serve as an informant had never prepared him for this. He wrote a new coded letter that night, explaining Viserys' death in full detail, including Daenerys' reaction. A thought uncoiled in his mind. Daenerys was now the last Targaryen heir, at least the last known living one. If the realm considered her a threat, it would be more important than ever to watch her carefully. But as he sealed the letter, he admitted to himself that the idea of her being snuffed out so easily had become less palatable to him. The new Daenerys Targaryen was someone who commanded respect, possibly even devotion. Jorah set the seal and pushed the thought aside. A spy did not have the right to such sentiments. The Khalasar soon departed V's Dothrak. Riding under the open sky once more, Daenerys' belly began to swell with new life. The Dothraki believed she carried the stallion who mounts the world, a prophesied conqueror who would unite their entire race and lead them to great glories. Khal Drogo bragged about his son often, and the Dothraki warriors pounded their fists in approval. Daenerys spoke of one day crossing the narrow sea. She insisted that the 7 kingdoms belonged to her by birthright, but she did so in a quiet, measured tone that showed she was learning the ways of leadership. Jorah rode at her side more frequently now, always with a pretense of looking after her well-being. She welcomed his presence. Sometimes she asked him about the politics of Westeros, and he found himself giving her genuine answers. He told her of the Northern Lords, the fierce people of the Iron Islands, and the cunning of House Lannister. He even described parts of the Stormlands where Robert had first raised his rebellion. The more she learned, the more determined she became to reclaim her family's inheritance. During these rides, something unexpected blossomed in Jorah's chest. It was a sense of loyalty not forced by penury or desperation, but born of admiration. He recognized the same determination that might have been in Rhaegar's eyes, if the stories were true. Daenerys was forging her own destiny out of adversity. Yet each time that admiration flickered, he beat it down with the reminder that he had debts to pay, that his traitorous messages had woven a net from which he could not easily escape. He feared that if Daenerys discovered his secrets, she would cast him aside at best, or have him killed at worst. And if Varys ever learned that he was growing too fond of his target, the spider might think him compromised. Thus, he walked a razor's edge, offering careful friendship to Daenerys while continuing to slip messages to the west. Their path took them to Lazer, a peaceful land of shepherds, where the Dothraki Khalasar fell upon the villages, taking slaves and plunder. Daenerys was horrified by the brutality. Here she and Drogo clashed. She rescued a Lazarene woman named Mirri Maz Dur from the rapine, insisting she be spared. Jorah found himself caught between his Khaleesi's mercy and the Dothraki's savage customs. He was no stranger to bloodshed, but he saw the compassion in Daenerys' eyes and realized it was genuine. She wanted to protect the weak, to set a different example. That night, After Drogo had roared his disapproval but ultimately let her keep the healer, Jorah stood outside Daenerys' tent. He wanted to say something reassuring, but the words caught in his throat. In truth, he felt torn. He had never met a Targaryen nor a woman like her, and the image of her fearlessly confronting her husband's savage warriors to protect a stranger tugged at something buried in him. But he reminded himself to remain guarded. He could not let her sincerity unravel his carefully maintained deception. Daenerys asked Mirri Maz Duur to tend to the wounded. Even Khal Drogo, who had taken a deep cut in the fighting, allowed the god's wife to treat his wounds. The tension in the air grew thick. Many in the Khalasar looked upon Mirri Maz Duur with suspicion, calling her a Magi. But Daenerys insisted. She was Khaleesi. Jorah, ever watchful, noticed the flash of malice in some of the warriors' eyes. Their fear of blood magic was well known. He reported these tensions in a message that same night, though what significance it held for the Spider's network, he could not say. The letter also mentioned Daenerys' pregnancy again, how she had found a new sense of purpose. If King Robert truly feared a Targaryen child, he would act soon. As Jorah pressed his seal into the hot wax, a wave of cold dread rippled through him. Events escalated when the cut on Drogo's chest began to fester. The mighty Khal, unstoppable in battle, grew weak, feverish. Daenerys, who had pinned so much hope on Drogo leading her across the narrow sea, watched in increasing alarm. She begged Mirri Maz Duur to use her knowledge to save him. The Lazarene woman agreed, but her form of salvation turned to blood magic. The ritual involved the sacrifice of the Khal's horse, chanting in a tongue that made the Dothraki recoil. They fled from the tent, fearing the malevolent spirits that the Magi might summon. Daenerys, unafraid, insisted on staying. Jorah alone remained by her side, though he quaked in the presence of such dark arts. In the midst of the ritual, chaos erupted outside. The Dothraki attempted to stop this abomination. Daenerys was struck in the confusion and began going into premature labor. Jorah, spurred by a protectiveness he could scarcely understand, carried her to the tent where the Magi worked, ignoring the screams and warnings that no one should enter. Inside, shadows moved unnaturally, and the air was thick with foul odors. Daenerys' screams merged with Drogo's feverish moans. Jorah saw the swirl of blood on the ground, the horrifying shapes that wriggled in the torchlight. He felt sure they were in the presence of something beyond mortal comprehension. By the time dawn broke, Daenerys had lost her child. Drogo lay silent, neither truly alive nor dead, trapped in a vegetative state. The Khal that had once loomed as tall as the horizon now stared at nothing, breathing faintly. The Magi explained, with a chilling calm, that Daenerys' child had been the price for this life, but it was no life at all. Devastated, Daenerys realized she had been betrayed. The Lazarene woman had used her dark arts to enact a terrible vengeance. In that moment, all the hope Daenerys had carried for a mighty Dothraki invasion and a Targaryen restoration seemed lost. Jorah, reeling from the horror of the night, tried to comfort her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling her tremble with shock and grief. Her eyes were distant, as though staring at 1,000 miles of empty sky. The Khalasar, leaderless and angry, began to splinter. Some followed a warrior named Mago, others scattered to follow other calls. Daenerys was left with a meager handful of faithful, and a brain-dead Drogo who only survived in the most wretched sense of the word. Jorah offered counsel, urging her to leave this place, but Daenerys refused to flee. She told him she would release Drogo from this husk of existence with her own hands. She smothered him with a pillow, tears rolling silently down her cheeks. For the first time in his life, Jorah felt an ache that was not driven by fear or regret for his own sake. He realized Daenerys had lost everything: her child, her husband, her claim to leading the Dothraki, and perhaps any chance of taking Westeros by force. It shook him to see her so broken. She would not remain broken for long. Daenerys commanded the remnants of her Khalasar to build a funeral pyre for Drogo. She placed dragon eggs, gifts from Illyrio that had been with her since her wedding, on the pyre. Some of the warriors looked confused, but she insisted. Jorah watched with mounting concern. He had heard the old tales of dragon eggs turning to stone, mere curiosities. The sun set, and the flames roared, devouring logs and oils. Mirri Maz-Dur was tied to a stake, her screams echoing into the night. Daenerys proclaimed that only death could pay for life. Jorah sensed the crackle of power in the air, though he could not understand its source. He begged her not to step into the flames. She ignored him, meeting his gaze with a strange serenity in her lilac eyes. And then, as the flames leapt high, she walked straight into them. He shouted her name, reaching to pull her back, but the searing heat lashed at him. He had to shield his face. He thought she must be consumed by the fire. Yet at dawn, when the pyre was nothing but embers, Daenerys emerged unburnt, the 3 dragon eggs hatched and clinging to her. Jorah fell to his knees, mouth agape. The few Dothraki left bowed in awe, calling her Mother of Dragons. Their savage chants echoed across the plains. In that moment, Jorah felt a wave of awe flood every fiber of his being. He was no man of devout faith, but this seemed a miracle, a sign that the Targaryen line was touched by something beyond mortal comprehension. He stared at the newly hatched creatures perched on Daenerys' shoulders and arms, mewling softly. Was this a mere trick of sorcery, or were the old prophecies true, that the dragons would return when the world needed them most? He found himself kneeling before her, swearing an oath of loyalty. The words left his lips almost of their own accord. He watched tears gather in her eyes, though she maintained a regal poise. Around her, the ash and smoke swirled, and the baby dragons hissed into the pale dawn light. Even as he pledged himself to her, a blade of cold reality sliced through him. He had betrayed her from the start. His messages, his coded letters, his quiet manipulations, they had all paved the way for her potential downfall. And yet here she stood, forging a new legend, the first Targaryen in centuries to walk through fire and birth dragons. In the hush of that dawn, he felt torn between shame and wonder. Could he continue deceiving her? Could he truly serve her when his loyalty belonged to the spider's web? He swallowed, tasting ashes. If he were to continue feeding the spider, it would be only a matter of time before Daenerys discovered his treachery. But if he ceased, Varys might punish him. His pardon would vanish like smoke. He would remain an outlaw and exile. Yet at this moment, that possibility felt less terrifying than losing the one leader who sparked a glimmer of real faith in him. He told himself he would think about it later. For now, he bent his knee as did the others. Daenerys looked upon them, forging them into the beginning of a new Khalasar, a new dream. As they prepared to travel south, crossing the Red Waste, Daenerys took stock of her meager resources. She had 3 newly hatched dragons, small, fragile things that needed to be fed on scraps of raw meat. She had less than 100 Dothraki riders left, most of them injured or weary from the recent turmoil. She had Jorah Mormont, an exiled knight with uncertain loyalties, though she believed him loyal to her. And she had her own strength of will, newly tempered by fire and loss. When she gazed upon Jorah, he felt as though she could see into the cracks of his soul, searching for any betrayal that might linger there. The desert tested them. The sun was merciless, water scarce. They lost horses along the way, and some of the Dothraki fell behind, unable to press on. But Daenerys refused to abandon those who lagged. She ordered Jorah and the other riders to help them onto the remaining mounts. She rationed water equally among all, including herself. Weeks passed in that infernal heat, and Jorah found himself newly captivated by her fortitude. Most of the men and women who followed her did so out of awe for the dragons, but Jorah knew the real heart of the matter. Daenerys' spirit radiated an aura that compelled devotion. Her small dragons grew each day, learning to snap at bits of charred meat. When they cried for more, Daenerys would hold them to her breast, cooing softly, unafraid of their sharp teeth. It was a sight that unsettled Jorah with its mixture of tenderness and danger. Finally, they reached the city of Qarth. Its gates were manned by the so-called 13, a council of powerful merchants and warlocks, each vying for influence in the greatest city of the region. They were received with curiosity, for rumors of living dragons had spread ahead of them, carried by travelers and merchants who had glimpsed Daenerys in the desert. The Qartheen were fascinated by spectacles, and Daenerys embodied the grandest spectacle of all, the mother of dragons. They offered her an opulent mansion to stay in, draped in silken tapestries, with pools of cool water to wash away the desert grit. Jorah watched with guarded suspicion. He whispered to Daenerys that Qarth was a city of illusions, where everyone wanted something in exchange for their hospitality. She smiled and nodded, acknowledging his counsel. That fleeting smile made him feel momentarily redeemed, as though all his sins might be washed away if he served her well enough. But deep within, he knew that no matter how many times he vowed to protect her, the stain of his initial treachery remained. In Qarth, Daenerys sought ships, gold, and allies to aid her quest for the Iron Throne. She presented her dragons to the 13, letting them see the living proof of magic reborn. They marveled and schemed. Xaro Zoan Daxos, a charismatic merchant prince, offered to marry her in exchange for half of her dragons, promising lavish wealth and an army of sellswords. Daenerys refused. She said the dragons were her children, not pieces of property to be traded. Jorah, lurking in the background, felt relief at her refusal, though it meant they remained dangerously vulnerable in a city full of ambition. Piet Pri, a warlock with eerie blue lips, also took interest in Daenerys, inviting her to the House of the Undying to meet his masters. Jorah pleaded with her not to trust them, suspecting that the warlock's hunger for power might overshadow their hospitality. Daenerys listened, but she also recognized she needed knowledge. She was still forging her path in a world that was equal parts wonder and peril. While Daenerys navigated the labyrinthine politics of Qarth, Jorah wrestled with his own dilemma. Should he continue sending reports to Varys? The question gnawed at him daily, especially now that Daenerys possessed dragons. If King Robert learned of this development, his fear would spike beyond measure. Assassins would almost certainly come. Jorah knew Qarth was far from Westeros, but gold could travel quickly, and the promise of a royal pardon might entice a murderer across half the world. He found himself hesitating each time he tried to dispatch a message. He told himself that the lines of communication were too tangled in Qarth, that he was not sure which merchant might be in league with the Spider's network. In truth, he was reluctant to betray her further. Every day spent in Daenerys's presence eroded another layer of his callous cynicism. And every day, he felt more certain that she was something extraordinary. Yet old habits died hard. Finally, one night, he slipped into a small wine sink in the corners of the city. The air was thick with incense, and a scarred man with one eye watched him approach. Jorah knew this contact from whispers, rumored to be a smuggler who had occasionally ferried messages for Varys. For a long time, Jorah just stared at him, words clogging in his throat. Then he said, "Tell the spider. Tell him the dragons live." The man nodded, expression blank. Jorah left a small purse of coins on the table and walked out, a sick feeling roiling in his gut. The die had been cast. He wondered if by morning, he would feel regret or relief. Qarth's grandeur began to lose its luster when Daenerys discovered that every door she knocked upon asked for the price of her dragons. Some wanted to see them caged in menageries, some wanted to experiment on them with sorcery. Few offered the unconditional alliance she craved. Food and lavish garments came her way, but no tangible resources to reclaim her throne. The warlocks grew increasingly persistent. Eventually, Daenerys decided she would visit the House of the Undying to hear whatever prophecy they claimed to possess. Jorah objected strenuously, but she insisted. He could not dissuade her. When she entered that twisted place, Jorah paced outside the gates, sword at the ready, sweat beading on his brow. Felt like an eternity. Then, a wail split the air, echoing with something unholy. Blue flames danced from the windows. Jorah rushed forward, only to find Daenerys emerging, clothes half-singed, her dragons screeching in fury. She told him the warlocks had tried to bind her, to keep her there for their spells. The dragons had burned Piet Pri's illusions, allowing her to escape. As they fled into the streets, Qartheen guards trailed them, confusion reigning. By the time dawn arrived, Daenerys had made enemies of the warlocks, and Xaro Daxos withdrew his support. She was all but exiled from Qarth, forced to depart before her foes could unite against her. The exodus from Qarth was hasty. Daenerys managed to secure a small ship, meager provisions, and a handful of loyal men. Jorah was among them, of course. He noticed how the city's towering walls and carved gates receded behind them, leaving Daenerys once again with only the open sea ahead. She stood on the deck, the wind whipping her silver hair around. Her dragons perched in small wooden cages near the rails to keep them from flying away. They screeched at the salt air and ruffled their fledgling wings. Jorah stood at her side, inhaling the brine-scented breeze. She turned to him, eyes distant, as though scanning an invisible horizon. "I have dragons," she said, her voice subdued. "Yet I feel as though I have no one. I cannot trust these cells' words. I cannot trust the Magisters. I have no illusions of love from the lords of Westeros, who sided with Robert to overthrow my father. Am I a fool to continue chasing the Iron Throne?" He wanted to tell her the easy lie, that she would triumph because she was destined for greatness. But something in her expression, the depth of her vulnerability, demanded honesty. He swallowed hard. "I do not believe you are a fool, my queen. The Seven Kingdoms have never seen a Targaryen like you. But it will not be easy. The lords remember the madness of your father. They fear the return of dragons. They might never accept you without a struggle." She looked away. "Struggle, I understand. My life has been nothing but." Her gaze flickered to the horizon again. "But I do not wish to become what my father was. The realm deserves better. I want to free the weak, not enslave them. I want to break the chains of cruelty that Robert and his lords still uphold in some corners of the realm. If that is the dream, Ser Jorah, can I count on you to help me see it through?" He felt something twist in his heart. The question echoed in the spaces where guilt festered. "You have my sword," he murmured. The vow tasted hollow, knowing he had once used that sword against her, in a way. But at that moment, he believed it more sincerely than any pledge he had ever made. He told himself he would send no further reports to Varys, that he would bury the betrayal in the deepest pit of his memory. But betrayal has a way of creeping back. The ship made port in the distant city of Astapor, at the edge of Slaver's Bay. The sprawling slave markets assaulted their senses with cruelty so normalized that few batted an eye. Rows of unsullied slave soldiers trained from youth were paraded before prospective buyers. Jorah had heard tales of their discipline. They were fearsome, unwavering, and expensive. Daenerys, seeing the conditions of these enslaved warriors, was appalled. Yet the hunger in her eyes to have an army that could help reclaim the Iron Throne warred with her revulsion at the master's barbaric practices. Krasny's Emonaklas, one of the good masters of Astapor, smirked at Daenerys, flinging insults in Valyrian, believing she did not understand. But Daenerys was no ignorant foreigner. She had learned Valyrian under her brother's tutelage long ago. She feigned ignorance, using a slave girl named Missandei to translate. Jorah watched with a mixture of admiration and caution. Daenerys was playing a dangerous game, bargaining for an army of Unsullied she hoped to free. Finally, Krasny's demanded a trade, all the Unsullied in Astapor in exchange for one of Daenerys's dragons. The man fixated on Drogon, the largest of the three. Jorah pleaded with Daenerys not to give away any of her dragons, but she wore a calm mask. She made the deal. Jorah was left in turmoil. Did she plan to truly give away a dragon? The day of the exchange arrived, and Daenerys handed Drogon's chain to Krasny's in front of thousands in the city's plaza. In return, she was given the ceremonial whip that symbolized ownership of the Unsullied. Jorah felt sick watching the beast roar in panic as Krasny's tried to control it. But then Daenerys spoke a single word in Valyrian, Dracarys. Flames erupted from Drogon's maw, engulfing Krasny's before he could even scream. The Unsullied, now under Daenerys' command, stood silent and unwavering. Daenerys cast aside the whip, declaring them free men. Yet she asked if they would fight for her as free soldiers. In unison, they slammed their spears on the ground in agreement. Astapor descended into chaos as the newly freed Unsullied stormed the streets to overthrow the other good masters. Daenerys rode at the front, her dragon screeching overhead, unleashing fire on the slavers' quarters. Jorah fought alongside her, sword flashing. He felt a strange elation, as though they were delivering long overdue justice. By sunset, Astapor lay at Daenerys' feet. She ordered the gates flung open, the slaves unchained. Crowds swarmed the plazas, chanting Mysa, meaning mother. Jorah watched Daenerys stand on a high platform, arms outstretched to the freed throng. The three dragons circled overhead, their shadows flickering across the dusty streets. In that tumultuous scene, Jorah felt a pang in his chest once more. Admiration, guilt, devotion, dread. So many conflicting threads bound him to her. He knew his betrayal could never be fully erased. Perhaps if they stayed in Essos, fighting these liberating wars, it might never be discovered. But if they ever crossed the sea and confronted the royal court, his name might surface in Varys' ledgers. Then all would be lost. Daenerys turned to him, eyes shining with righteous fervor. "We will not stop here," she said. "We will free the slaves of Yunkai and Meereen, and then we will sail for Westeros. They call me Mother. Let me prove worthy of that name." Jorah nodded, forging a mask of support. Inside, he stewed with the knowledge that each victory she claimed would only paint a larger target on her back. Robert might be dead by now. The rumors suggested King Joffrey Baratheon or some other occupant might sit the throne. Still, the Lannisters would hardly welcome a Targaryen's return, especially one with dragons and an army of freed slaves turned loyal soldiers. War would come, and every shred of knowledge about her weaknesses would be priceless. Even if Jorah had ceased sending dispatches, the old messages he had already sent still lingered like poison in the wind. Yunkai fell in a similar manner, though more swiftly, as the city's defenders cowered at the sight of dragons and Unsullied. Meereen, the greatest of the three slaver cities, posed a more significant challenge. Its high walls and fighting pits gave it a proud tradition of warfare. Daenerys camped outside the city, forging alliances with local freedmen who yearned for liberation. She learned of the great masters and their exploitation of the slaves in the fighting pits. Outraged, she swore to break their hold. In the labyrinth of politics that followed, Jorah proved invaluable. He negotiated with sellsword companies, gleaned intelligence from local informants, and helped Daenerys orchestrate a plan to infiltrate Meereen's walls through the sewers. The city fell, albeit with more bloodshed than the previous two. When the dust settled, Daenerys beheld thousands of cheering slaves, freshly freed, chanting Mysa yet again. But she also saw the complexities of ruling a vast city, teeming with old traditions, resentful masters, and a precarious economy. She decided to stay in Meereen as its queen, to learn the art of governance before marching to Westeros. Jorah supported her, hoping this might delay any direct confrontation with the Seven Kingdoms, thus buying him time to bury his past sins deeper. But fate is not so easily manipulated. Rumors abounded that the Lannisters were locked in a brutal war back in Westeros, that King Joffrey was dead, that a new King Tommen sat the Iron Throne. Daenerys weighed whether the time was ripe to sail west. Yet she lingered. She wanted to prove she could rule justly, not just conquer. Meereen's politics were a tangled knot of rival factions, hidden murders, and sabotage. The Sons of the Harpy began to strike from the shadows, killing freedmen at night, trying to incite chaos. Jorah did what he could to keep Daenerys safe, patrolling the halls of the Great Pyramid, his sword ever ready. He hardly slept, spurred by an urge that he told himself was duty, though it felt more like devotion. Daenerys, for her part, maintained a calm facade, but he could see the toll wearing on her. She missed the open skies of the Dothraki Sea, missed the freedom of simply moving forward. Now she was tethered to a throne in a foreign land, with responsibilities that weighed on her day and night. One hot afternoon, as the sun glared through the high windows of the throne room, Ser Barristan Selmy arrived. The legendary knight had once served Daenerys' father and then King Robert, but he now presented himself as a loyal subject of the true queen. Daenerys welcomed him graciously, enthralled by tales of his prowess and integrity. Jorah felt a prickle of unease. Ser Barristan was an honorable man, known for his unwavering adherence to truth and justice. If anyone were to suspect or recall that Jorah had once been pardoned by the crown for sending intelligence about Daenerys, it would be Barristan. The tension in Jorah's shoulders grew each time the old knight spoke with quiet confidence of the realm's history. The inevitable confrontation arrived sooner than Jorah expected. Late one evening, Barristan asked for a private audience with Daenerys. Jorah, sensing trouble, found a vantage point near the corridor leading to her private chambers. Through a crack in the door, he overheard the old knight speaking in a grave tone. Barristan told Daenerys that he had discovered documents in King's Landing verifying that Jorah Mormont had served as an informant for Varys at the very time Daenerys was married to Khal Drogo. The Spider's ledger mentioned coded letters from Pentos and beyond, containing details only Jorah could have known. Daenerys's voice, trembling with fury, asked if these letters continued. Barristan admitted he did not know the entire truth, only that Jorah had been in the Spider's pocket when they first met. Jorah braced himself, heart hammering. He heard Daenerys shout for him. Slowly, he stepped into the chamber. Barristan glared. Daenerys, her eyes alight with betrayal, demanded to know if it was true. Jorah tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He managed to say he had done terrible things before he knew her, that he had acted out of desperation for a pardon, that he had ceased sending letters after he truly came to believe in her cause. Tears pooled at the corners of Daenerys's eyes, but her voice was cold as winter's edge. "You betrayed me," she said in a choked whisper, "from the start, even before we crossed the Red Waste, before I hatched my dragons. All that time you stood by my side, smiling, advising me. You were in league with those who wanted me dead." She did not give him time to explain his remorse or how he had wrestled with guilt every day. Her hand shot up, commanding silence. She said that she would not have him killed, for he had saved her life many times, but she would not suffer his presence any longer. She ordered him to leave Meereen by the next dawn. If he was found within the city after sunrise, he would be seized and executed. Jorah looked into her eyes, hoping to see a flicker of mercy, of the bond they had forged. He found only hurt and rage. Barristan stood behind her, silent but unyielding. Jorah realized, with nauseating clarity, that his betrayal had finally caught up to him. He tried to beg for her forgiveness. "Khaleesi, Daenerys, I love. Do not speak that word to me," she hissed, tears burning on her cheeks. "You know nothing of love or loyalty. You served the usurpers who took everything from my family. You let them poison me with your secrets. And now, at the moment of my triumph, you come to me with your pleas? Go. Go before I forget that I once felt affection for you." Her words flayed him. She turned away, refusing to look at him. He backed out of the chamber, heart pounding in his ears, unable to catch his breath. The door slammed shut. In that single moment, Jorah realized all his rationalizations had been for nothing. Everything he had done to try to keep one foot in each world had collapsed. He had lost her trust, her regard, everything. The next morning, he rode out of Meereen alone, banished and broken, with the scorching sun beating down on him like a hammer on an anvil. And so it was that Ser Jorah Mormont paid the ultimate price for his original sin. He had betrayed Daenerys Targaryen from the very start, and though he had grown to admire, even love her, no penance could erase the bitter truth. The Mother of Dragons might rise to glorious heights, might even one day take the Iron Throne, but Jorah would not be at her side to see it. As he rode into the desert wastes, he wondered if he had damned himself thrice over. First for his crimes on Bear Island, second for being a Spider's informant, and third for foolishly allowing himself to love the woman he was meant to watch and betray. His journey would continue, aimless and anguished, haunted by the phantom of Daenerys' disappointment. The memory of her unwavering gaze in that final moment, the heartbreak laced with anger, would follow him through the scorching heat of day and the frigid chill of night. Whether he lived or died, Ser Jorah Mormont had already lost the only cause that could have redeemed him. He had betrayed Daenerys Targaryen from the start, and in the end, that single act overshadowed all the devotion he had tried to offer. The desert winds carried his lament into the emptiness, scattering it to the indifferent sands, while far behind him in Meereen, a queen with 3 growing dragons set her gaze upon the horizon, determined to rule the world without the man who had broken her trust when she needed it most. Jorah Mormont left Meereen at dawn, as Daenerys Stormborn had commanded, with the scorching sun already a fierce presence on the horizon. He rode an old, sway-backed horse given to him by the guards who had escorted him beyond the city gates, silent men who offered no words of farewell. The city receded behind him, massive pyramids diminishing in a haze of dust and heat. He did not dare look back. The memory of Daenerys's tearful rage in her private chamber stayed vivid in his mind, replaying in a loop he could not escape. He recalled each tremor of her voice, the tightness in her features as she condemned him, and the final flicker in her eyes when she forced herself to turn away. She had severed him from her circle of trust as cleanly as a sword might take off a limb. The day stretched long and punishing, the desert air hot enough to sear skin. Jorah drank sparingly from his water skin, knowing that if he lingered too close to Meereen, her soldiers might change their minds about letting him go. In truth, he felt almost indifferent to whatever fate might befall him. He was exiled from Daenerys's presence, an exile more complete than the one that once drove him from Westeros. As the hours trudged onward, his mind alternated between a dull numbness and frantic self-recrimination. He had meant to stop sending reports, truly, but old sins like iron shackles had clung to him. Now those sins had carved a gulf between him and the only cause he had ever truly believed in. By the time night spread its cloak across the sky, Jorah had reached a cluster of modest hills pockmarked with small caves. He tethered his horse near a withered bush and crawled into one of the shallow hollows. Hunger gnawed at him, but not as sharply as the memory of Daenerys's parting words. His supplies were meager: dry dates, a piece of stale bread, and the remainder of his water. He ate a few bites and tried to sleep. The sand offered no comfort, pressing into his side and filling every crease in his clothing. He drifted in and out of a half-sleep, haunted by murky dreams of a young girl with silver hair stepping into flames, of a wounded Khal lying comatose beneath star-swept skies, of the same girl standing above him in a throne room, tears turning to cold fury. At dawn, he pressed on. Days turned into a blur as he traveled south along the fringes of the desert. Now and then, he glimpsed caravans, traders heading toward Meereen or Yunkai. Some recognized him as the disgraced knight who had once ridden at the side of the Mother of Dragons, while others simply spat at the sight of an obvious Westerosi. None offered him more than a meager exchange for coin he barely possessed. A few nights, he bartered with passing merchants for a spot by their campfires. They asked him for news of the Queen with Dragons, and Jorah would speak as neutrally as he could, wanting neither to damn her nor to betray his heartbreak. Whenever he was asked his name, he lied, offering only the barest pseudonym. If Daenerys had cast him out, he no longer wished to wear the name Ser Jorah Mormont as a badge. Let it sink into the sand along with the illusions he had harbored. His wanderings eventually led him to a small coastal outpost on the Jade Sea, where battered ships came and went carrying spices, exotic fruits, and throngs of the desperate. He spent a day there, uncertain if he had enough coin to book passage anywhere. In truth, he did not know where he desired to go. Westeros was barred to him by royal decree. If the Lannisters still sat the Iron Throne, he would be a condemned criminal the moment he arrived. And even if he chanced to sneak into the north, his old home of Bear Island was no longer his. He had betrayed the trust of the Starks, of his own father, and of King Robert's regime. The only partial pardon he had hoped to secure was the one he had tried to earn by spying on Daenerys. That hope was ash in the wind. He roamed the docks, listening to dockworkers hawk their labor and sea captains boast of safe passages. The stench of fish, stale sweat, and exotic spices filled the air, mingling under the harsh sun. Jorah's coin pouch was nearly empty, but he still had his sword, which a captain of ill repute might accept in exchange for a guard's service. He learned of a ship bound for Volantis, the oldest city of the Valyrian freehold. Rumor said that Volantis was rife with turmoil these days. Foreign sellswords, red priests proclaiming visions of Azor Ahai, and all manner of cunning triarchs. Jorah did not relish diving into another pit of intrigue, but the alternative was to remain in the parched outpost until thirst or thievery claimed him. With little to lose, he bartered his strength as a hired sword for the voyage. The ship was an unremarkable two-masted brigantine known as the Salt Raven. Its hull bore scars from storms and collisions with hidden reefs. The captain, a haggard woman named Oranna Till, looked Jorah up and down with an appraising eye. He expected her to inquire about his past. Instead, she merely asked if he knew how to hold a sword. He nodded, pressing his hand to the pommel at his hip. That was enough for her, and she tossed him a scrap of salted fish and indicated where he could bunk below decks. She made it clear that if any pirates boarded them or mutineers stirred among the crew, she expected him to act as the sword she was paying for. Jorah took the bunk, the fish, and the uneasy quiet that followed. In some corner of his mind, he recalled the first sea voyage he had taken after fleeing Westeros. Then, he had been terrified of the gallows that awaited him if he returned. Now, the sense of aimlessness weighed heavier. It was not only the gallows or the law that haunted him, but the knowledge that the one person he had truly come to believe in, truly love, had banished him for treason. It was a wound that bled in his soul, slow and inexorable. The Salt Raven set sail in the evening under a pallid moon. Jorah stood on the deck, watching the coastline disappear. He shut his eyes and felt the sea breeze tug at his beard. The swirl of brine and fish entrails from the hold was not pleasant, but it was a change of air from the desert dust. He exhaled, letting the motion of the ship remind him that life continued, whether or not he wanted it to. They reached Volantis after several weeks at sea, battling storms and the threat of corsairs. Jorah earned his keep once when a band of freebooters tried to board the Salt Raven near the Isle of Elephants. He cut down 2 men, receiving a deep slice across his left bicep in the process. Oranna Till grunted approval at his skill, tossed him a rag for the bleeding, and declared that he had paid his fare twice over. When they finally slipped down the mouth of the River Roine and beheld the immense black walls of Volantis, Jorah found himself unsettled by the city's scale. Volantis was ancient, older even than the Valyrian freehold, sprawling on both sides of the river, connected by a long bridge that was practically a city in itself. Elephant sigils adorned the banners, and flame-painted tigers roared from mosaic tiles. Slaves wearing tiger stripes trudged through the streets, branded with the Volantine markings that declared them property. Oranna paid him off with a small handful of coins, then nodded curtly, clearly relieved to be rid of him. Jorah disembarked and strode onto the docks, where fishmongers in ragged garments shouted bargains, and wealthy visitors traveled in ornate litters carried by slave-bearers. The swirling mass of humanity made Meereen seem small by comparison. Volantis had an air of ancient arrogance, as though it knew it was the oldest and, in its own mind, the grandest city in the known world. Jorah quickly learned that the city was governed by 3 triarchs, each elected for a year's term, typically from wealthy aristocratic families who favored either the Elephant or the Tiger Party. The political rivalries were fierce, and the city bristled with tension. Jorah wandered, uncertain of his next step. He felt the press of people around him, all with their own ambitions and intrigues, and not a single soul cared about the plight of a banished knight. He found a cheap inn near the eastern wall, where the slaves were housed in cramped barracks on the far side of the sea. It reeked of unwashed bodies and sour ale, but it offered a straw pallet and a roof, so Jorah accepted it for a single night's fee. He laid down his meager gear and collapsed onto the pallet, exhausted. That night, his dreams were filled with images of dragons circling overhead, silver-haired queens with reproachful eyes, and the stench of molten gold poured upon the brow of a screaming man. He woke in a cold sweat, cursing himself for his own memory. He could not simply outrun his conscience. Perhaps he would drown it in cheap drink, as he had once tried in Pentos. Yet the thought brought him no relief. As the days turned into weeks in Volantis, Jorah eked out a living doing minor mercenary work. He guarded small merchant caravans crossing the long bridge, or stationed himself outside gaming dens to ward off thieves. He never stayed in one place long enough to form attachments. Word of the Mother of Dragons reached even here, carried by travelers from Slaver's Bay. Most of the rumors were contradictory. Some claimed she planned to march on Westeros any day, that her army of Unsullied now numbered in the tens of thousands. Others insisted she had been murdered by her own freed slaves, or that she had vanished in the Dothraki Sea. Jorah tried to glean kernels of truth. He heard rumors that she had married again, rumors that she had been assassinated, rumors that she was forging alliances with the Red Priests. In a city as vast and rumor-ridden as Volantis, it was impossible to separate fact from fiction. Now and then, Jorah found himself lingering at the edge of the Temple of the Lord of Light, where red-robed priests chanted about a coming savior. They proclaimed that a great war was looming, darkness versus light, and that those who walked through fire unburnt bore the sign of the Lawloress chosen. Some even whispered Daenerys' name as a possible Azor Ahai reborn. Jorah felt an odd pang in his chest. He wanted to believe she was alive, forging a new path without him. Even if he could never be at her side again, he wanted her to succeed. The alternative was too bitter to contemplate. In time, Jorah realized Volantis held no future for him. He was but one among countless swords for hire, haunted by a past that kept him from forging alliances. So he left the city, traveling upriver in a battered barge that carried spices and dyes. He soon found himself deeper into the vast territories of the Rhoyne, weaving through smaller towns and outposts. The further north he went, the more he heard news of war across the narrow sea. The War of the Five Kings had ended, replaced by new turmoil. A boy king named Tommen sat on the Iron Throne, guarded by the Lannisters and Tyrells. There were whispers of unrest in Dorne, of a reawakened threat in the north, a war with the dead. Jorah scoffed at such tall tales, but he could not fully dismiss them. He had seen wonders, dragons hatching from stone eggs, a woman unburnt by flames. Who was he to say the dead could not walk? He drifted, never staying in one place for long. His coin dwindled. His sword arm, though still formidable, found fewer and fewer employers who could pay. In some dusty tavern in Selhurries, he caught sight of an abandoned notice pinned to a wall. It bore the sigil of House Bolton, newly installed wardens of the North, though many Northerners reviled them. The notice promised good coin for fighting men willing to sail to Westeros and bolster the Boltons' hold. Jorah tore the parchment down and stared at it. The mere idea of returning to the North as a hired sword for the Boltons, those traitors who had betrayed the Starks, filled him with revulsion. He crumpled it and tossed it aside. Perhaps a more desperate man might have seized that chance, but Jorah could not swallow that final shred of pride. He found temporary respite in a small fort overlooking a tributary of the Rhoyne, where a minor Associ lord named Morato Ilkin employed him to train local youths in swordsmanship. It was a quiet arrangement, and for a time, Jorah thought he might remain there, living out his days in obscurity. He taught the youths to parry and thrust, corrected their footwork, and tried not to think of Daenerys. Yet her face lingered in every unguarded moment, and the guilt in his belly never fully eased. He found no solace in the hush of the fort's stony corridors or the subdued rhythms of a small farmland. Word eventually reached him through a traveling minstrel that the situation in Meereen was dire. The Sons of the Harpy waged a bloody insurgency, the newly freed slaves were restless, and Daenerys Targaryen was rumored to be in the thick of it, half the city praising her as Mysa, the other half plotting her downfall. The minstrel wove grandiose stories about dragons terrifying the populace, about unrelenting violence in the streets at night. Jorah's heart pounded with each new detail, even though he realized half of them might be exaggerations. He could almost see her, standing in the Great Pyramid, steeling herself against betrayal after betrayal. If she had cast him out, whom could she trust now? He tried to force the thoughts aside, reminding himself that his presence could only do her harm. She wanted him gone for good reason. But nights were long in Morato Ilkin's fort, and the question of her fate gnawed at him until he found it impossible to remain still. There was a sense of inevitability building within him. He had to see her again. If it meant risking her renewed wrath, so be it. He could not abide the thought of her undone by enemies when he had a chance to set things right, even if it cost him his life. So he left the fort in the dead of night, leaving a brief note of apology to Lord Morado and the youths he had trained. By dawn, he was on the road east. He sold his meager possessions, keeping only his sword and a modest amount of supplies. The journey would be arduous, crossing deserts and plains to reach Meereen again, but he had traveled that route once and survived. Determination hardened within him, fueled by a flicker of purpose he had not felt since Daenerys banished him. The weeks that followed were punishing. He found a caravan traveling toward the Bay of Dragons, once Slaver's Bay, though rumor said Daenerys aimed to rename it. He bartered his sword arm as protection against bandits, rode at the flank of a lumbering train of mules and wagons piled high with fabrics, grains, and goods from the Rhoyne. It was a diverse company. A handful of merchants with sly smiles, a pair of freedmen from Yunkai who despised the old slaver nobility, and a mysterious woman who called herself Keza, draped in veils, who claimed to be a seer. Jorah kept mostly to himself, but he caught glimpses of Keza staring at him. One night, as the caravan camped by a sparse grove, Keza approached him with a quiet footfall. He was cleaning his sword by the firelight when she sat across from him. She lifted her veil, revealing a face lined with faint scars. Her eyes were an unsettling pale gray, and she spoke in a voice as soft as a whispering breeze. "You go to Meereen," she said, "but it is not your city. It is a city of dragons, yes?" Jorah did not respond immediately, uncertain if she was guessing or possessed some uncanny knowledge. Finally, he muttered, "I have unfinished business there." She nodded. "All men have unfinished business in the East these days. It is said that Queen will challenge the world." A pause. "You have left her once. Why return?" He felt his heart skip. No matter what I've done, I would not see her destroyed." Keza regarded him for a long moment, the firelight dancing in her eyes. "Then I wish you well, knight. Perhaps your journey will matter, or perhaps it will end in ashes." With that, she lowered her veil and slipped away, disappearing into the shadows. In the days that followed, her words rolled around in his mind. The caravan made slow progress across the savannas and desert stretches. Now and then, they fended off small groups of raiders, and Jorah's sword sang with a deadly resolve. He had always been a competent warrior, though once he fought purely to survive or to earn coin. Now he fought as if battling all the guilt that weighed on him. The caravan guards gave him space, recognizing a man with demons in his past. Eventually, they caught sight of the Great Pyramid of Meereen looming in the distance, a wedge of sandstone and brick rising against the sky. Jorah felt a surge of conflicting emotions: dread, anticipation, longing, guilt. It had been perhaps a year since he was exiled, maybe more. Time had blurred. The city's outer slums seemed larger, as though refugees had poured in. The stench of uncollected refuse hit them even before the walls came into view. The old gates, once battered by Daenerys' armies, stood repaired and heavily guarded. As the caravan approached, Jorah realized entering Meereen openly might prove difficult. She had banished him on pain of death if he ever returned. The guards loyal to her might well carry out that sentence, or perhaps the Sons of the Harpy would kill him first. Who truly controlled the city now, he could not be certain. He parted ways with the caravan before they entered the main gates, slipping into a throng of foreigners peddling wares. He pulled up the hood of his tattered cloak, grateful for the swirling dust that obscured faces. Meereen streets were rife with tension. Freedmen wandered listlessly, complaining of hunger and harsh taxes. Former slave masters huddled in groups, muttering about the new order. Unsullied patrolled in small detachments, their discipline evident in every step. Jorah recognized the crest of the three-headed dragon in some banners, but it was tattered and soiled by the city's dust. The Freedmen's Watch, locals who had formed a militia under Daenerys' governance, were sporadically scattered at intersections. They looked exhausted and battered by conflict. He kept to side streets as best he could, slipping through winding alleys, ears alert for any mention of Daenerys. He found a ragged boy who appeared to be a street urchin, and with a few copper coins, he bought scraps of rumor. The boy said Daenerys was indeed still in the city, but that her hold was precarious. There had been an outbreak of violence 2 moons ago, culminating in an assassination attempt at the Great Pyramid. The queen had survived, but many of her close advisors had been killed or wounded. The boy could offer no names. Jorah felt his pulse pound. Which advisors had fallen? Had Ser Barristan survived? Missandei? Grey Worm? He yearned for answers, but the boy only shrugged. One name, however, came up repeatedly in the streets: Hisdar zo Lorak. Jorah recalled him as a Myrinese noble who had tried to broker peace in the city, even courted Daenerys' favor. Some said he was her consort at one point, though the exact details varied. Others insisted that Daenerys had left him in charge for a time, but that he had proven unreliable. Now, rumors swirled that he was dead, or maybe locked in a dungeon. The swirl of half-truths frustrated Jorah, but he gained one certainty: the city was riven by division. Daenerys might still rule in name, but her enemies were legion. Quietly, Jorah maneuvered through the lower districts, stepping over rubble and broken barrels. The smell of rot clung to every corner. Night came quickly, and with it, an uneasy hush. Lanterns flickered from shuttered windows, the occasional shout echoed in the distance, and a sense of fear pressed in on him. He found a wretched boarding house run by a half-blind old woman. There, he paid a few coins for a corner of a cramped room with no bed, just straw on the floor. He slept fitfully, sword clutched to his chest, listening for any sign that the sons of the Harpy might come prowling. At dawn, he roamed closer to the Great Pyramid, mingling with a line of petitioners who sought audiences or favors from the queen. A ring of unsullied stood guard at the main entrance, their spears upright, faces expressionless. Jorah kept his hood drawn low. He did not know if any of these men recognized him. He did not see Grey Worm among them. The man would have been easy to spot by his commanding stance. Instead, the officer in charge was another unsullied, smaller in stature, with a scar across his temple. They were allowing small groups to climb the steps to the throne room, but the process was slow and heavily monitored. Unsure of his next move, Jorah drifted away from the crowd. Then, a voice whispered his name from behind. He nearly jumped, hand going to his sword. A slender figure in a hooded cloak stood there, gripping his arm gently. A woman's voice, soft but urgent, spoke in the common tongue. "Ser Jorah? Is that you?" He recognized her after a moment. Ura, one of the freedwomen who had once served in Daenerys' household as a seamstress. He had seen her in the corridors of the pyramid, always quiet, often overshadowed by Missandei. She looked thinner now, hollow-cheeked. Her eyes darted left and right as though every shadow threatened her. "What are you doing here?" she asked in a hushed tone. "If the queen finds out." "I need to see her," Jorah said firmly. "It's important." Ura shook her head. "She banished you. Barristan told us what happened, how you... She trailed off, uncertain or unwilling to speak the words of betrayal aloud. "Why come back now?" He exhaled, heart pounding. "Because I couldn't stay away knowing she was in danger. I have to help. Even if she doesn't want my help, He shook his head, at a loss to articulate the tangle of guilt and devotion that had driven him back. Ura studied him, her lips pressed in a tight line. "You must know that she's changed, Ser Jorah. The city has worn her down. The betrayals, the constant battles. She still tries to do what's right, but she's grown suspicious of everyone. And she's lost so much." A tremor in her voice. "Grey Worm nearly died. Ser Barristan was wounded, had to recover in secret. Others are gone." Jorah felt as though a hand had clenched around his heart. "And her dragons? They grow larger by the day, but she struggles to control them. Drogon especially, he disappeared for a time, returning only when he pleases. Regal and Viserion roam the skies around Meereen, sometimes scaring the populace." She looked at him intently. "If you truly wish to help, You cannot simply walk in and ask for an audience. She might have you executed on the spot, or her new advisors might do it before she even knows you're here." He stiffened. "New advisors?" Ura nodded, glancing around nervously. "Ser Barristan remains, but there are others, Dario Naharis, the Sellsword captain she once favored, and a few Myrinese counselors. And there's Tyrion Lannister." She saw Jorah's incredulous look. "Yes, a Lannister is here, though the Queen claims he's not like his family. He arrived some moons past, along with Varys the spymaster. That caused quite a stir." Jorah's mouth went dry at the mention of Varys. The spider himself was in Meereen? Did Daenerys know of his past involvement with Jorah's treachery? Of course she did. Barristan would have told her everything. Tyrion Lannister's presence was another shocking turn. He had heard rumors of a dwarf Lannister rumored to be a kinslayer, a fugitive from Westeros, but he never imagined Tyrion would end up here, advising Daenerys. "Then, she has no shortage of clever men at her side," Jorah said, forcing out the words. "Clever, yes," agreed quietly. "But the city is still bleeding. The sons of the Harpy kill in the streets at night. Trade is disrupted. Daenerys tries to maintain her authority, but she's often forced to take harsh measures. Many say she's becoming as ruthless as her father was rumored to be." She paused. "I don't want to believe that, but fear is everywhere. They say she contemplates flight to Westeros, leaving Meereen to its fate." Jorah swallowed. He recalled the resolution in Daenerys's voice when she had declared she would learn to rule before claiming the Iron Throne. Circumstances must be dire indeed for her to consider fleeing without finishing the work. "How can I get to her?" he asked. "I need to speak with her alone." Ura hesitated. "Alone might be impossible, but there's a safer way than trying to storm the pyramid. Ser Barristan sometimes rides out in the early mornings with a small guard, checking on the unsullied outposts. If you could intercept him in secret, he might grant you an audience. He's an honorable man, Ser Jorah. He might hate you for what you've done, but if he believes you truly mean to atone, he could at least get you inside without the others killing you." Jorah nodded, mind reeling. It was a slender hope, but hope nonetheless. Ura gave him directions. A certain stable yard near the pyramid where Barristan often met a few unsullied to begin his inspections at dawn. Then she told him to keep his hood low and say nothing to anyone. "If you cause trouble, if the Queen hears you've been creeping around, she might think you're a spy again, or the sons of the Harpy might find you first." Ura's eyes shone with desperation. "This city has had enough bloodshed. If you make things worse, I'll never forgive you." She slipped away, vanishing into the crowds. Jorah lingered, repeating her instructions in his head. A plan began to form. He would find Barristan in the morning, reveal himself, and beg for the chance to see Daenerys. If the old knight decided to kill him, Jorah would not resist. Perhaps that was his penance. But if there was even the slightest chance of re-earning Daenerys' trust, or at least doing something to help her, he would seize it. He spent the rest of the day hiding in the labyrinth of alleyways, evading both suspicious freedmen's watch patrols and the watchful eyes of potential Harpy sympathizers. He ate sparingly, a piece of stale bread and water from a cistern that smelled faintly of sulfur. His mind dwelled on the possibility of her reaction if she saw him. He pictured her face the day she had stepped from Drogo's funeral pyre, unburnt and resplendent, the baby dragons clinging to her. He recalled the gentleness with which she had once spoken to him in the early days of her marriage, not yet hardened by the burdens of queenship. But that gentleness had been marred by his betrayal. Night fell at last, and he dozed in a cramped alcove, sword on his lap. The city was far from silent. Distant shouts, the clang of metal, and the occasional drumming of feet on cobblestone told him that another violent night had gripped Meereen. He felt the weight of it pressing down, and a question nagged him. Had the city's turmoil been made worse by the betrayal that had robbed Daenerys of trust? Perhaps if he had been honest from the start, or if he had never spied on her, she might have relied on him without reservation. Now, her alliances were fragile, her nights filled with enemies at every corner. He clenched his fists, wrestling the guilt into silence. Before dawn, he crept toward the stable yard Jorah had described, a small area behind a row of storehouses near the southwestern side of the Great Pyramid. The smell of horse dung and sweaty hides was unmistakable. Hiding behind a crumbling brick wall, he waited. Sure enough, as the sky began to lighten, the stable doors opened. 2 Unsullied emerged, leading 3 horses. Then Ser Barristan Selmy appeared, wearing a light mail shirt under a plain tabard. The old knight's hair was thinner, his posture a bit more stooped than Jorah remembered, but he still radiated calm authority. His eyes scanned the yard, and for a moment, Jorah feared Barristan might sense his presence in the shadows. The Unsullied assisted Barristan in mounting a dark chestnut mare. A third man, a freedman or a local guard, helped adjust the bridle. Jorah's heart thumped. He had to choose a moment to reveal himself. If he startled them, the Unsullied would likely thrust their spears through his gut before he could speak. But if he waited until Barristan was gone, the chance would slip away. So he swallowed his dread and stepped out slowly, keeping his hands spread to show he was unarmed for the moment. Immediately, the Unsullied snapped to attention, spears angled. Barristan's eyes locked on Jorah. For a heartbeat, the old knight looked confused, as though uncertain he recognized the figure in the hood. Then Jorah pulled back the hood, revealing his face. Barristan's expression twisted into shock and anger. He dismounted in a swift movement belying his age, hand dropping to the hilt of his sword. The freedman guard looked ready to shout an alarm, but Barristan raised a hand. His voice, when he spoke, was as cold as steel. "You dare show your face here, Mormont?" Jorah held himself still, ignoring the beads of sweat forming at his temple. "Ser Barristan, I come unarmed save for the sword at my hip, which I have not drawn." He looked at the Unsullied. "I only ask for a moment of your time. Then, if you decide I am a threat, do what you must." Barristan's knuckles whitened on the sword's grip. "You were banished by the Queen. You returned in defiance of her orders. That alone is reason enough to kill you, and that's without revisiting your original treachery." Jorah bowed his head, contrite. "I make no excuses. I did what I did, and I have suffered the consequences. But I heard the city is in turmoil, that her life is in danger daily. I could not stay away." His voice strained. "I have information, or perhaps I can be of some use. If nothing else, I can stand between her and another blade that might threaten her." Barristan's fury simmered just beneath the surface. He glanced at the Unsullied, then back at Jorah. "And what if you're here to serve another master? The Spider Varys always had a fondness for you, did he not?" Jorah flinched. "Varys never had a fondness for me. He used me, and I let him because I was desperate to return home." The shame was thick in his voice. "I am done with that. If you wish to kill me, do it. But if you believe in the Queen's mercy, if you believe in redemption, give me a chance to speak with her, or with you alone, to see if I can help." For a long moment no one moved. The Unsullied were poised, awaiting Ser Barristan's command. Finally, the old knight exhaled, and his grip on the sword eased slightly. "The Queen will not be pleased." He shot Jorah a glare. "But she deserves to decide your fate, not me. Besides, you say you have information. By all rights, I should throw you in a cell. And that is what I shall do, until the Queen decides what to do with you. If you resist, you'll die here." Jorah lowered his head in acquiescence. "I won't resist." Barristan beckoned the freedman guard. "Bind his hands. We ride for the pyramid at once." The guard pulled out a length of rope. Jorah offered no resistance as his wrists were tied behind his back. The rope bit into his flesh, but he gritted his teeth. He reminded himself that this was what he had chosen, a slim chance at seeing Daenerys. Barristan remounted, ordering Jorah to walk behind the horses. The Unsullied flanked him, spears at the ready. It was a silent, tension-fraught procession. Dawn had fully broken by the time they reached the Great Pyramid's gates. Onlookers gawked at the sight of the man being escorted by the Queen's men. Some recognized him, perhaps from the old days, and shouted epithets or questions. Others just shrugged, too caught in their own struggles. Inside the pyramid, Barristan led them to an antechamber off the main hall. He dispatched the freedman guard to alert the queen and her advisors. Jorah's pulse hammered. Would she come here? Would she order him dragged before her in the throne room for a public spectacle? Would she have him executed on the spot, or would she choose to speak with him in private? There was no way to know. Barristan and the Unsullied waited in stony silence. Jorah kept his eyes on the polished marble floor, the swirl of old memories assaulting him. He had stood in these corridors countless times, once as her loyal advisor, and all the while he had been sending messages across the sea. A wave of self-disgust churned in his gut. No matter what happened, he vowed he would not hide from the consequences any longer. After a tense wait, the freedman guard returned, accompanied by a short man with mismatched eyes, brown and green, and a sardonic expression that could only be Tyrion Lannister. A swirl of half-cloak hung over his shoulder. Behind him walked Missandei, the young translator, her face troubled. Jorah's gaze flicked about, searching for Daenerys. She was not with them. Tyrion cocked his head at Jorah. Well, Ser Jorah Mormont, or so I presume, the dwarf said. I was told you were exiled, and now you return in ropes. You really can't stay away, can you? Jorah mustered a steady voice. I have no quarrel with you, Lannister. My quarrel is with my own mistakes. Tyrion pursed his lips. Your mistakes being that you informed on our queen to King Robert. The same Robert who tried to murder her. Yes. Jorah's cheeks burned with shame. Yes. Missandei's eyes reflected hurt. She had always been polite to Jorah, even friendly, and to see him now a prisoner seemed to unsettle her deeply. You risked your life coming back, she said softly. Why? Because she is in danger. I want to help, Jorah replied. He glanced at Ser Barristan. I know I have no right to ask, but let me speak with her. Hear me out. Tyrion and Barristan exchanged looks, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Tyrion sighed. Her grace is occupied at the moment. She has a meeting with several Myrinese nobles to discuss grain distribution and the reopening of the fighting pits. She will not be pleased to learn you're skulking in her halls. I suspect she'll want your head on a spike. He rubbed his temple. But perhaps we can handle this with a bit more tact. Barristan frowned. He belongs in a cell until she's free. Then she can decide. Missandei stepped forward, surprising them all. Forgive me, Ser Barristan, but the Queen has asked to be informed immediately of any developments that affect the security of her reign. Ser Jorah's return is certainly such a development. Should we not? Barristan hesitated. Tyrion studied Jorah's expression. The dwarf's mismatched eyes seemed to probe for weakness. Finally, Tyrion relented. Very well. We'll inform her promptly, but we won't bring him storming into the throne room in the middle of negotiations. Let's place him under guard in a private chamber. We'll keep it quiet. Let the Queen finish her business, and then she can address this personally. Barristan nodded, though his jaw was tight. As you say, but if he tries anything, I'll see him dead. No one doubted he meant it. They led Jorah down a corridor, up a short flight of steps, and into a small chamber that had once served as a storage room. Inside stood a single chair and a wooden table strewn with old linens. An arrow-slit window let in a thin wedge of light. Two Unsullied took positions outside the door. Barristan and Tyrion conferred in low voices before departing. Missandei lingered a moment longer, gazing at Jorah. I'm sorry, she whispered. I never thought it would come to this. He gave her a wan smile. Neither did I. She left and the door closed. Jorah stood in the dim room, hands still bound, back aching from tension. Hours might pass before Daenerys arrived, or perhaps she would not come at all. He feared she might simply ignore him and order the Unsullied to rid her of this nuisance. He could not blame her, but deep inside, a slender thread of hope sustained him. Time dragged. Occasionally, a servant entered with a small cup of water, or the freedman guard peeked in to ensure Jorah was still there. Jorah tested his bonds now and then, wincing at the chafing on his wrists. The arrow slit gave him glimpses of the city beyond. The sprawl of Meereen's rooftops, the haze of dust in the streets, the far-off glint of the harbor. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent. Still, no summons came. He sank onto the chair, exhaustion setting in. Memories drifted through his mind unbidden. Daenerys stepping onto the deck of a ship at Carthage harbor, the gentle tilt of her head when she asked him a question about Westeros. He remembered her unbridled joy when she had first ridden her silver horse across the grass sea, the sunlight illuminating her hair like living moonlight. Each recollection felt like a knife in his chest. At last, near sundown, the door opened. An unsullied soldier stepped in, spear in hand, and spoke in a crisp voice. "Come!" Jorah rose. He had lost feeling in his hands. The soldier gripped his arm firmly and escorted him through winding corridors. They ascended a flight of stairs that ended in a large set of bronze doors. Jorah recognized the route. This led to the Queen's audience chamber. His chest tightened. He swallowed hard. The doors swung open, revealing a wide chamber lit by tall bronze braziers and thick candles. The walls were adorned with tattered Meereenese tapestries. At the far end stood Daenerys Targaryen on a raised dais, flanked by Tyrion Lannister and Ser Barristan. Grey Worm stood slightly behind her, stoic, though his left arm was bandaged. Missandei hovered near the Queen, a scroll in her hands, and standing a step closer to Daenerys, closer than Jorah expected, was Daario Naharis, the flamboyant Sellsword captain. Daario rested his hand on the hilt of a curved dagger, his expression one of faint mockery. Jorah's breath caught at the sight of her. She wore a deep blue gown, her silver gold hair braided and wound atop her head. The flicker of torchlight highlighted the angles of her face, lending her a regal, almost ethereal appearance. Yet beneath that splendor lay a hardness in her gaze. A year of ruling Meereen had not been kind. There was an undercurrent of weariness in her posture. She stared at Jorah, who stood shackled and filthy, and for a moment, no one spoke. When Daenerys finally broke the silence, her voice was as cold as an ocean wind. "Remove his gag, if he has one, and unbind his hands, but keep guards close." Barristan signaled the Unsullied, who stepped forward and cut the rope around Jorah's wrists. The sudden release made his arms ache. He resisted the urge to rub them, instead keeping his gaze lowered in a gesture of respect and contrition. "You have returned, despite my explicit command," Daenerys said, her words measured and devoid of warmth. "Give me one reason I should not have you thrown from the top of this pyramid." Jorah straightened, meeting her stare. He felt his tongue go dry, but he forced himself to speak. "I have no reason that will wipe away my betrayal," he said, voice raw. "I can only tell you that I heard the city was in peril, that you were in danger. I couldn't stay away, no matter the risk." Her eyes narrowed. "My city is always in peril. What new threat do you think you can save me from? The sons of the Harpy? The Yunkish armies? Or do you think to protect me from your spider friend?" There was bitterness in her tone. Jorah shook his head. "I serve no one but you, if you would have me. I know you may never trust me again, but at least allow me to fight for you, to stand guard if another assassin tries to strike." Tyrion coughed softly. He was found loitering near the stables at dawn, apparently prepared to cast himself on your mercy. This is either a cunning ploy or a very foolish gesture. Daenerys stepped forward, descending from the dais to stand only a few feet away. Jorah could smell the faint scent of lavender on her. Her dragons were not present, but he imagined them perched somewhere high above or slithering through the darkness. Her voice took on a quieter, more dangerous timbre. "You told Robert Baratheon about me, about my pregnancy with Khal Drogo, about every move I made in Essos. He tried to have me killed more than once." Her gaze flicked to the scar on his cheek, a relic of some past skirmish. "You stood by my side as I struggled, and all the while you kept sending letters. You claimed you loved me, yet you betrayed me from the start. Now you return. Why?" She paused, and the air in the room seemed to vibrate with tension. Jorah forced himself not to look away. "Because I do love you," he said, voice trembling despite himself. "Because I realized that the only life worth living was one spent defending you and your cause. I have made mistakes, many of them, but I can't undo the past. I can only offer my life now." He sank to one knee, ignoring the ache in his joints. He bowed his head, his voice quiet. "I don't ask for your forgiveness, nor do I expect it. I only ask that you do not turn me away again. If I can be of service, let me prove it. If not, then kill me here and now. I would rather die at your command than wander the world aimless." Silence weighed heavily. Dario glanced at Daenerys, as if gauging her mood. Ser Barristan stood rigid, his face a mask. Tyrion stroked his beard, eyes keen with interest, as though analyzing a puzzle. Grey Worm maintained his watchful stance, though his lips tightened slightly. Missandei's brow furrowed with empathy, but she said nothing. Daenerys turned away abruptly, her gaze sweeping the chamber. Her fists were clenched at her sides. She walked a few paces, then spun back to him. "I have no shortage of enemies, Ser Jorah. Meereen teeters on the brink of chaos. The sons of the Harpy strike at freedmen. Yunkai threatens to reclaim its slaves. I am surrounded by advisors, some of them wise, some cunning, some loyal, but I am tired of being betrayed." Her voice caught, and for a moment, Jorah saw the flicker of the young woman who had once been forced to wed Khal Drogo. Then her anger resurfaced. "You say you love me, yet you cost me that sense of trust. My heart is hardened now. Can you understand that?" He nodded, words choking in his throat. She lifted her chin, regarding him with an almost regal detachment. "Why should I believe you won't betray me again?" He swallowed. "Because I have already lost everything by doing so." A trembling exhale. "I have no home, no family, no future. The only hope I had was to see you triumph. If you will not allow me to aid that triumph, I have no reason to exist." She studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded at Grey Worm, who stepped forward and gripped Jorah's arm, lifting him to his feet. The Queen addressed him again, her voice brittle. "I will not have you killed. Not today, but neither will I welcome you with open arms. You'll remain under guard. You will not step outside the pyramid without my leave. If I have even the faintest inkling that you're passing information to my enemies or scheming behind my back." She let the unspoken threat hang in the air. Jorah bowed his head. "I understand." Relief and heartbreak mingled in his chest. She was not throwing him to his death, yet she was also making it plain that trust would not come easily, if at all. Tyrion moved closer, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Interesting. So we have a disgraced knight returning from exile, claiming renewed fealty. Possibly sincere, possibly not. The question is how to make use of him." He looked at Daenerys. "Shall we see what he knows of Yunkai's and Astapor's current dispositions? He might still have contacts." Daenerys's mouth tightened. "Very well. Use him. Speak with him. If he can provide intel that helps us quell these rebellions, then perhaps he might redeem himself." Her gaze swept over Jorah like a knife's edge. "But do not forget, your betrayal started all of this. If you had told me about your letters sooner, if you had come clean of your own accord, I might have forgiven you. But you waited until Barristan uncovered the truth. That wound does not heal easily." Jorah's voice wavered. "I know. I can only offer my life in penance." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "We shall see how much your life is worth. Now get him out of my sight. I have other matters to attend to." Grey Worm and two Unsullied led Jorah away. As he was marched through the corridors, he caught a glimpse of her turning, resuming her place on the dais, while Tyrion and Dario approached with expressions of curiosity and guardedness. The last thing Jorah saw before the chamber doors closed was her silhouette, poised in the flicker of torchlight, as if weighed down by every betrayal she had ever endured. And so, Jorah found himself neither cast out nor truly accepted. A man in limbo. The Unsullied took him to a small set of quarters within the Great Pyramid, Nothing more than a cramped stone room with a narrow bed and a single window. Grey Worm gave curt instructions. Jorah was to remain there except when summoned for questioning. The guard stationed outside would allow him to visit the privy or fetch water, but no further. An unspoken tension hovered. Any sign of disobedience might result in swift and permanent punishment. Alone in that cell-like chamber, Jorah sank onto the bed, finally letting out a trembling breath. He had seen her again, heard her voice. She had not killed him. He felt both gratitude and despair, for the gulf between them remained yawning and deep. He told himself that if he truly loved her, he would do whatever it took to aid her cause, even if she never forgave him. That resolution glimmered like a fragile candle in the gloom. The next day, Tyrion arrived, accompanied by Missandei and a pair of Unsullied. They questioned Jorah about Astapor's remaining power structure, about Yunkai's mercenary legions, about any knowledge he had regarding the Sons of the Harpy. Jorah answered honestly, holding nothing back. He described his travels, the rumors he had gathered, the trade routes that might be used to smuggle weapons into Meereen. Tyrion listened intently, occasionally making a quip or pressing for details. Missandei jotted notes on a wax tablet, her expression guarded. Jorah could sense her heartbreak beneath that professional facade. She had once admired him. He knew, and now she struggled to reconcile that memory with his betrayal. Hours passed as Jorah recounted every scrap of knowledge he possessed. Finally, Tyrion nodded, folding his arms. Well, if half of what you say is correct, we can cut off certain smuggling lines from Yunkai. That might curtail the Sons of the Harpy's arms supply. He glanced at Missandei. We'll bring this to the Queen's attention. She may want to verify it further. If it proves false, that will go poorly for you. Jorah lifted his chin. It's not false. I have no motive to lie now. Tyrion studied him. You might be surprised how quickly motives change in a city like Meereen. But for now, I'll take your word under advisement. He signaled the Unsullied. Keep him here. We'll speak again soon. In the days that followed, Jorah's existence settled into a grim routine. Guards brought him meals. Simple fare of bread, rice, and watered wine 3 times a day. Sometimes Tyrion came to question him further, or Barristan demanded clarifications about old intelligence. Occasionally, Missandei entered quietly, reading him dispatches about the city's condition, asking if any detail sparked a lead. Jorah did what he could, feeling more like an informant in a different sense now, giving Daenerys all the information he had gleaned over years of travel. He rarely glimpsed her. Once, he saw her crossing a corridor in conversation with Grey Worm, her face set in a grim line. She did not look his way. Another time, he passed her at a distance in a courtyard, where she was gazing at one of her dragons, Viserion, pale and sinewy, basking in the sun. She placed her hand on the beast's snout, speaking softly. Jorah stood transfixed by the sight, an ache filling him. But she never acknowledged him, never so much as turned her head. News trickled in that some of his intelligence had proven useful. The Freedmen's Watch raided a hidden storehouse where contraband weapons from Yunkai were found. A minor victory. Tyrion and Ser Barristan both grudgingly admitted that Jorah's information had saved lives. Yet the city still simmered with tensions. Sons of the Harpy attacks, rifts among the freedmen, murmurings about the reopened fighting pits that Daenerys had once closed. One evening, Tyrion and Daario Naharis came to Jorah's chamber, both looking troubled. Daario in particular seemed agitated, pacing the small room. We have credible reports that the Sons of the Harpy plan a major attack during the next pit games, Tyrion explained. The Queen will be there, as a show of strength. We need to ensure her safety. Daario scowled at Jorah. You claim you love her, old bear? Then prove it. We need a man inside the stands, someone who might recognize the signs of an ambush. The Sons often cloak themselves as freedmen or foreign visitors. You've been around them enough to possibly sense their presence. Think you can do that? Jorah stood, heart pounding. I'll do anything to protect her. Tyrion nodded slowly. If the Queen agrees, we'll place you discreetly in the crowd. You'll have an escort of Unsullied to ensure you don't slip away. but you'll be in plain clothes. We want you to keep your eyes open. Should trouble arise, you'll assist in quelling it." Jorah knew this was his first tangible chance to prove himself in the field rather than just in words. "When is this event?" "3 days from now," Daario replied, running a hand through his blue-dyed hair. "The Queen hates the idea of the fighting pits, but she reopened them under pressure from the local nobility, hoping to maintain peace. If we can show strength and thwart an attack, maybe it will stabilize things. If we fail, it'll be a bloodbath. The Sons will never fear us again." Jorah straightened, ignoring the flutter of nerves in his stomach. "I'll succeed, or die trying." Daario snorted. "Let's hope you don't die and leave us no one to blame if this goes wrong." He shot Jorah a challenging look. "I still don't trust you. If I see the slightest hint of treachery—" "I have no illusions, Naharis," Jorah said quietly. "If anything goes wrong, I expect to pay the price." Tyrion glanced between them. "We'll speak to the Queen. If she consents, we'll lay out the full plan." They left, and Jorah felt a tremor of anticipation. He might finally be permitted to do something that could save Daenerys' life in a critical moment. If the gods were kind, it would be enough for her to see that he was not her enemy. The day of the games arrived under a scorching sun. The fighting pits were a grand arena of sandstone and carved seating, ringed by columns. Spectators poured in from all over the city, freedmen eager to see the spectacle, former masters wanting to relive old traditions, foreign envoys curious about this queen and her manner of rule. Jorah, dressed in simple brown tunic and trousers, took a seat in a middle row with 3 unsullied close by. A straw hat shaded his face from the glare. He scanned the crowd, eyes darting for any sign of masked figures or unusual gatherings. Daenerys arrived with her retinue, Barristan, Grey Worm, Missandei, Tyrion, and Daario. She sat in a prominent box overlooking the arena floor, her expression composed, though Jorah sensed tension in the way she held herself. Trumpets blared. The first matches began. Freed gladiators against volunteer fighters. The crowd roared. Jorah felt a pang of unease at the sight of blood being spilled for sport, but he remained focused on scanning the stands. Partway through the event, Jorah's gaze caught a cluster of men shifting positions behind a pillar. They wore the clothes of freedmen, but their postures were furtive, and one carried a cylindrical object under his cloak. Jorah stood, heart hammering. He gestured to the Unsullied at his side, whispering, "There, by the south pillar. Something's off." The Unsullied nodded and began moving through the crowd, but before they could reach the group, a sudden commotion erupted. One of the men whirled, brandishing a small crossbow. He aimed it at the royal box, only to be tackled by an onlooker. Chaos rippled outward. Another figure, masked in a harpy's visage, sprang from behind a bench, hurling a dagger toward the box. Shouts rang out. Jorah realized there were more of them scattered around. The Sons of the Harpy had coordinated a multi-pronged attack. Acting on instinct, Jorah raced down the steps, shoving through panicking spectators. Up in the box, Daario and Barristan had drawn swords. Grey Worm was struggling with a masked assailant who had leapt into the royal area, and Tyrion was ducking behind a seat. Daenerys stood, eyes wide with alarm, scanning the chaos. Another masked attacker hurled a spear. It missed her by a hair, clattering against the stone behind her. Jorah reached the base of the steps leading to the box. An armed harpy leapt in front of him, blade flashing. Jorah drew a short sword from an unsullied guard's belt, parried the attacker's blow, and drove him back. The masked man spat curses, lunging again. Jorah knocked aside the blade, then plunged his sword into the attacker's chest. Blood spattered the sandstone. The masked figure collapsed with a wet gurgle. Shouts from above. A second masked attacker was closing in on Daenerys, who stood partly unguarded as Daario and Barristan engaged multiple foes. Without hesitation, Jorah sprinted up the steps, ignoring the crush of bodies. He arrived just as the attacker raised a curved dagger at Daenerys' back. Jorah barreled into the man, sending them both crashing into a column. The dagger clattered away. Before the harpy could recover, Jorah slammed the pommel of his sword into the masked face, then drove his blade through the attacker's torso. The man jerked, then went limp. Panting, Jorah turned to Daenerys, who clutched the railing, breath ragged. Their eyes locked. For a split second, the chaos seemed to recede, leaving only their shared breath. Then more harpies erupted onto the arena floor, surrounding the stands. The Freedmen's Watch rushed in from the lower gates, trying to contain the panic. Daario and Barristan led a group of Unsullied to clear a path for Daenerys. Grey Worm, injured but still on his feet, gestured for her to follow. She hesitated, glancing at Jorah, who stood with bloodied sword in hand. He had saved her life a heartbeat ago. She gave him a curt nod of gratitude, then turned and joined her protectors as they began to retreat toward the exit corridor. Jorah fell in step beside them, fending off another attacker who lunged from the side. The group made its way through the labyrinth of corridors under the stands, the din of screams and clashing steel echoing in the background. At one point, Tyrion stumbled, cursing, and Jorah hauled him upright, earning a quick thank you. They pressed on, emerging into a side courtyard. The air was thick with dust and fear. Harpy agents were still battling Freedmen's Watch. Above, a roar thundered in the sky. Jorah looked up to see a dark shape circling. One of the dragons, possibly Drogon, drawn by the commotion. Daenerys's retinue sought to regroup. Barristan was bleeding from a cut above his brow. Daario breathed heavily. Grey Worm clutched his side. Daenerys stood in the middle, face pale but resolute. "We must get back to the pyramid," she said, voice firm. "We'll be safer behind its walls." A fresh wave of masked harpies emerged from an adjacent passage. The defenders braced themselves. Suddenly, a deafening shriek rent the air. Drogon descended into the courtyard in a blur of black scales and beating wings, unleashing a torrent of flame. The harpies screamed as fire washed over them. Jorah threw himself in front of Daenerys, shielding her from flying embers. The heat was immense, singeing the hairs on his neck. Drogon landed with a thunderous impact, tail lashing, teeth snapping at any foe within reach. Smoke billowed. Jorah coughed, eyes watering. Through the haze, he saw Daenerys step forward, her hand raised. "Drogon, my child." Her voice cut through the chaos. The dragon swung its massive head, nostrils flaring, and recognized her. It let out a rumbling growl, as if admonishing the harpies for daring to threaten its mother. The harpies who survived the initial blast scattered, fleeing in panic. Daario and Barristan seized the opening, leading Daenerys and the others to safety behind the cover of the dragon's rampaging fury. Jorah covered the rear, cutting down a wounded harpy who tried to throw a dagger. The corridor beyond was clear enough for them to slip away, leaving Drogon to wreak havoc on any remaining attackers. By the time they reached the pyramid, battered but alive, the day had turned to dusk, the sky streaked with crimson. Daenerys was whisked to her chambers by Missandei and a handful of Unsullied. Barristan insisted on personally overseeing her safety. Jorah lingered in the grand foyer, sword still in hand, panting. Tyrion approached, wiping blood from a shallow cut on his forearm. Daario stood at a distance, arms crossed, lips pressed in a thin line. Tyrion spoke first. "Well, that was eventful. You've a knack for saving the queen at critical moments, Mormont." Jorah said nothing, just stared at the blood coating his blade. He had risked everything to ensure Daenerys' safety, and it seemed he had succeeded, at least today. Daario finally exhaled, stepping closer. "I don't trust you," he said quietly, "but I owe you my thanks for saving her life back there." He inclined his head, albeit stiffly. "Perhaps you're not the traitor I took you for." Jorah set his jaw. "I betrayed her once," he murmured. "I won't do so again." Tyrion nodded, eyes flicking to the corridor where Daenerys had vanished. "She'll likely want to speak with you, once she's had a moment to catch her breath. Don't waste this chance." Relief and anxiety coiled in Jorah's gut. He had proven himself in blood and chaos, but would it be enough to rekindle even a spark of Daenerys' trust? He returned to his quarters under guard, nerves jittery. Servants brought him water to wash the blood away. He cleaned himself in a basin, wincing as he found new bruises forming on his arms. The fight had been fierce. When he finished, he sank onto the bed, mentally replaying every detail. He saw again the fleeting moment when Daenerys looked at him after he killed the harpy behind her. In that instant, there had been something in her eyes, surprise, gratitude, and perhaps a glimmer of the old bond they had once shared. Night enveloped the pyramid. Jorah half dozed, half waited, uncertain if she would summon him or if she needed rest, or if she would choose not to see him at all. At last, near midnight, an unsullied arrived, instructing him to follow. Heart-pounding, Jorah did so, walking through deserted corridors lit by flickering torches. They came to a private balcony overlooking the city. There she stood alone, gazing out over the rooftops. Her silver hair was unbound, cascading over her shoulders. A single lantern illuminated the space, casting shifting shadows on the stone floor. The guard bowed and withdrew. Jorah swallowed, approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the hush. "Your Grace," he murmured. She did not turn. Her voice carried on the warm night breeze. "I used to think that if I freed enough people, if I was kind enough, just enough, I could remake the world into something better. But my enemies keep coming, and the cost keeps rising. I reopened the fighting pits to appease the old guard, and they used that event to try to kill me." She paused. "I am so tired of blood." Jorah's throat felt tight. He stepped to her side, though he kept a respectful distance. The city lay below, torches and lanterns twinkling like scattered stars. "I wish I could tell you there's a simpler path," he said quietly. "But this land, like Westeros, is soaked in the blood of old battles. You've done what few have dared. You freed the slaves, you took a stand. And now you face the fury of those who thrived on the old ways." She finally turned to him. The moonlight caught her features, revealing the exhaustion in her eyes. "You saved my life today." He dipped his head. "I would do so again without hesitation." She studied him in silence for what felt like an eternity. "I saw you kill the man behind me, the one who would have driven a dagger into my back. You've always been capable of brutality, Ser Jorah, but I realize now you used it to protect me, not to serve yourself." He felt the weight of her scrutiny, knew she could still condemn him. "I made a vow a long time ago to protect you and serve you. For a time, I forgot that vow in pursuit of my own redemption in Westeros. But no more." Her expression was unreadable. Then, to his surprise, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Do you think it matters?" she asked, voice trembling. "How can I trust anyone, knowing how easily trust has been broken before?" She looked away, tears slipping free. "I have lost so many. Viserys, Drogo, my child, even those who were not truly mine to lose. My heart feels like a burned field where nothing can grow." A lump rose in Jorah's throat. He yearned to comfort her, but he dared not lay a hand on her without permission. "I cannot erase the hurt I caused," he said softly. "But I swear on my father's name, on my honor, whatever shred remains, that I will never again betray you. If you send me away, I will go. But if you allow me to stay, I will fight for you until my dying breath." She turned back to him, her tears now contained by sheer force of will. "Words," she whispered, "are easy, but your actions today showed me more than words could." She inhaled, as if steeling herself. "I am not ready to forgive you fully. Perhaps I never will. But I see now that you are not my enemy. The city remains in turmoil, and I need every loyal sword I can muster." Jorah bowed his head, relief flooding him, though it was tinged with sorrow. "That is more than I deserve, yet I will accept it. Thank you." She hesitated. "You will remain close under Ser Barristan's watchful eye, and under Grey Worm's command if there is another emergency. I value your counsel. Once it was invaluable to me, but do not expect to stand at my side as before. You must earn that place again, if it can be earned at all." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment, his throat thick, Then he managed, "I understand. I will prove my worth each day, or die trying." She regarded him one last time, and in her eyes, he saw the old pain warring with the faintest spark of hope. "We shall see," she said quietly. Then she turned toward the city lights again, a lone figure carrying the weight of an empire on her shoulders. Jorah lingered a moment, watching her silver hair stir in the night breeze. He wanted to kneel, to pour out every ounce of devotion, but he sensed that she needed space, for her sake as well as his own. So he inclined his head and retreated. Behind him, the city hummed with unresolved conflict, and above, the moon glowed like a silent guardian. His betrayal from the start still cast a long shadow, but there, in the hush of a Myrinese night, he felt the barest stirrings of absolution. She had spared him. She had acknowledged his rescue. Perhaps that fragile bond could grow again, if he tended it with unwavering loyalty. He returned to his small chamber, heart pounding from the magnitude of what had transpired. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he allowed himself a glimmer of optimism. The road to true forgiveness might be long, perhaps impossible, but he was once again in her orbit, allowed to serve rather than languish in exile. If he could protect her from the Harpies, the Yunkish, or any other threat, maybe, just maybe, he could restore some fraction of what he had shattered. Days and nights merged into a grueling pattern of vigilance. Jorah worked tirelessly under Grey Worm's supervision, assisting with patrols through the city's troubled districts. He scoured the underbelly for sign of hidden Harpy cells. Sometimes he joined Barristan in strategizing how to deal with the Yunkai blockade that threatened to choke off food supplies. Slowly, grudgingly, a few of Daenerys' advisors began to accept his presence. Daario still shot him distrustful looks, but Tyrion occasionally engaged him in conversation, gleaning insights on associate alliances. Missandei was polite, though the old warmth in her demeanor was subdued. Every so often, Jorah would catch a glimpse of Daenerys in passing. A brief meeting of eyes as she departed a council session, or a nod of acknowledgement when they crossed paths near the pyramid's courtyard. She offered no open smiles, no private conversations beyond what was necessary. Yet each time, he sensed her barriers softening by degrees. He told himself not to hope for too much too soon. It was enough that she had allowed him to remain. Meanwhile, the city remained a tinderbox. Incidents flared in the streets. Minor riots over food shortages, skirmishes between freedmen and former masters. The Sons of the Harpy still orchestrated nighttime assassinations, though Jorah's intelligence helped thwart several plots. Tyrion worked diplomatic channels, forging precarious alliances with local merchants. Daario led strikes against known Harpy hideouts, sometimes with Jorah's help. The two men never grew friendly, but they found a mutual respect in bloodshed. Weeks slipped past, and although the city did not attain peace, it reached a kind of strained stability. Daenerys' authority held, bolstered by the knowledge that her dragons were real and her unsullied formidable. The Yunkish lords bickered among themselves, granting some respite. The blockade persisted, but Tyrion managed to negotiate limited trade, enough to keep the city from starvation. Slowly, the Freedmen's Watch grew more organized, and the Harpy attacks waned in frequency. Late one afternoon, Jorah found himself summoned to the council chamber. He arrived to see Daenerys seated at the head of a long table, flanked by Missandei and Tyrion. Barristan stood behind her chair, arms folded. Daario was off on a mission, it seemed. Grey Worm was absent as well, presumably still recovering from an injury. A map of the surrounding region was spread across the table, pinned at the corners by figurines. Daenerys glanced at Jorah, then gestured for him to stand on her left, across from Tyrion. "We have received a report," she said without preamble, tapping a spot on the map. "A Yunkish force is moving toward Meereen from the south. They mean to test our defenses, perhaps to besiege us again." Tyrion stroked his beard. "Our scouts say it's a sizable detachment, possibly accompanied by a new Sellsword company. We're not sure if they're paid by Yunkai alone or if Volantis is involved." Barristan's gaze flicked to Jorah. "We need accurate intelligence, not just rumors. If they are massing for a proper siege, we must prepare the city. If they're simply testing our perimeter, we could counterattack outside the walls. Daenerys folded her hands.